Hi everyone, my name's Peter Bradley and I'm the MLA Project Manager for the Livestock Genetics portfolio. Today's webinar that we were meant to have in person but sadly has been cancelled. The topic I was planning on presenting on and will today in this webinar is selecting genetics to improve weaning. To get started, I just thought I'd give you a quick overview of my presentation and what we're planning to cover today. So first of all, I wanted to touch on what are Australian sheep breeding values, or ASBVs, how we're going to use them in practice and how to make the best progress by using ASBVs. And then thirdly, dive into actually using ASBVs to improve weaning outcomes. So what are Australian sheep breeding values? In this section, I'll touch on the importance of genetics, what is an ASBV, and how it's calculated. But to start off, I thought I'd just use an analogy. I'm a bit of a car fan myself. And I think genetics is a little bit like cars. It's about what's under the hood that matters. And I'll use this example. It was actually from Top Gear. I don't know if anyone has seen that. There was an episode where the Australian Top Gear presenters challenged the English Top Gear presenters to a race, a drag race over a certain distance, but they had to use a vehicle that was commonly used by tradies in their country. So of course the Australian presenters chose a Holden Maloo ute. Meanwhile, the British presenters, they didn't have a lot of choice and had this Ford Transit van. So obviously the Australian presenters, it looks pretty fancy. We know those Holden utes go fast. But what they didn't know was the English presenters had actually modified their Ford Transit van. So it didn't look particularly fast. But if I actually told you before the race that the Holden Maloo, yes, it had a 6-litre V8 and produced 380 horsepower. But the Ford Transit van that the English presenters had modified actually had a Jaguar V6 twin turbo motor that produced 542 horsepower. So if you're to pick the fastest vehicle on looks alone, you're probably going to choose the Maloo. But once you know what's under the hood, that's what really matters. And obviously the English presenters in this case won the race. And I think genetics is a little bit the same. You can look at an animal, but it's really understanding the genes that animal carries that is going to improve your business. So we know that there are a couple of factors that influence how an animal performs or the appearance of the animal, and that is a combination of the environment and the genetics of the animal. So performance could be anything from the amount of wool cut or the amount of the kilos of lamb produced, and that's influenced by the environment. The environment can mean a whole range of different things, from the diseases or parasites that animal was exposed to, the feed that animal had access to and how it was raised, right through to if it was born a single or a twin. And then obviously there's the genetic component. So when you're purchasing a ram, you're not purchasing the environment it was being raised in, you're purchasing the bag of genes. So when purchasing rams on sale day, you obviously look at the physical ram that's presented in front of you, but there's a lot of factors that influence what that animal or how that animal looks on sale day. Obviously the feed that animal has been exposed to, so it has been a paddock fed animal in a pretty good season on grass, or it has been raised in a shed on feed its whole life. Also the age of the animal. So we know older animals generally appear larger. If it was born and raised a single or a twin or even a triplet in some cases, the age of its mother, so was it a maiden ewe or was it a 3 or 4 year old ewe that it was born to? And then, of course, the disease and parasites that animal has been exposed to. So that they're all factors that contribute to what that animal looks like on sale day. But the important thing that you're going to a sale day to purchase rams on is the genes that animal carries to take home to your flock. So what is an ASBV? So an ASBV is what we call Australian sheep breeding value, and it provides an estimate of those genes that animal will pass on to its offspring. So it removes all those different environmental impacts that we saw influence an animal's appearance. One important concept when talking about genetics is the heritability of a trait. Now, you could read that first dot point as heritability is the proportion of phenotypic variance that is due to additive genetic effects. And that doesn't sound particularly interesting or exciting, but another way to think about it is the more heritable a trait is, the more of what you're seeing is due to the genes rather than the environment. So more of what is measured or apparent in the parent is passed on to the offspring. So different traits have different heritabilities. We've got traits that have high heritability, meaning that the environment actually doesn't make up as much of the animal's physical phenotypic performance that you see. So a really good example of a highly heritable trait is fiber diameter. We know there is an environmental impact on fiber diameter, but the heritability, so what you're seeing in that animal is actually highly heritable, meaning a large proportion of that is going to be passed on to its offspring. But then we also have traits that are lowly heritable, so meaning that the environment has a big impact on the phenotype or what's expressed on that animal. And another really good example here of a lowly heritable trait is reproduction. We know that if the ewe's ability to raise or get in lamb, how many lambs she conceives, and then raise those animals is hugely influenced by the environment. So the impacts of pests and predators like foxes or bad weather events is another really good example of how our environment can influence reproductive performance. But there is still a component of reproduction that is controlled by the genes of the animal. And even though a trait is lowly heritable, that makes it even more important that we use breeding values to select for that trait, because we know that there's still a component that is influenced by the genes. So heritability is a pretty key part of an ASBV. So we take into consideration heritability when calculating ASBVs. And that's really important. So you don't have to worry about which traits are highly heritable or lowly heritable. When looking at an ASBV, that's already been considered. We also look at the performance of the animal itself. So weights recorded by breeders, for example, on that animal. We look at the performance of its siblings, so its full siblings. How's it performing? How are they performing, whether it be half brother, half sister, or a full sib? And obviously, because they're related, they share genes in common. So by using information from those animals, we can get a better estimate of the genes of the animal that we're interested in. Likewise, when we also look at information from that animal's sire and dam. So how did its mum and dad perform? Again, those on-farm traits recorded, so whether it be a fleece weight, whether it be an ultrasound scan, we look at all of those factors when calculating an ASBV. We also take into account the environment that animal has raised in. So breeders that submit data or ram breeders that submit data to calculate ASBVs also tell us about the environment it's raised in. So they tell us if this animal was fed, so if it was fed differently to the other group of animals. So all of that goes into calculating an ASBV. And more recently, we've also started to use genomic information. So when ram breeders are actually now taking DNA samples that are genomically analysed and get incorporated into the breeding values of an animal. So we're more accurately looking at the genes that that animal carries and therefore will pass on to its offspring. So where can you buy rams with ASBVs, or what rams can you buy with ASBVs? The answer is nearly every major breed in Australia. You can buy rams with breeding values on them. So whether you're buying merinos, you can compare poll and merinos together on breeding values. We also have a maternal analysis, so you can compare all animals within the same analyses and their breeding values. So you can compare Bordelesters, Coopworths, and composite maternals. And then if you're buying a terminal ram, you can compare all of these and their breeding values. So you can compare Poll Dorsets, White Suffolks, Dorpers, Hampshires, and a range of other breeds that fall into that terminal analysis. So chances are, if you're buying rams each year, there are rams of your breed that would have ASBVs available. So the next thing I wanted to look at was actually using ASBVs in practice, how to interpret them, and then also using another tool that we have called selection indexes. So one of the key things in understanding ASBVs is understanding the shorter trait abbreviations that we express breeding values as. So most traits, and this is a general rule of thumb for a majority of traits, there are some that are exceptions, but we'll focus on the general rule. So the first letter of a breeding value is often the age stage that breeding value refers to. So for example, if it has a W at the start, it's referring to the weaning age stage. If it has an A at the start, it's referring to the adult age stage. And then we have a range of different trait abbreviations. So I've listed some key ones there. So YCFW, clean fleece weight, and that's expressed as a percentage. We've got fiber diameter, eye muscle depth, weight, fat, and worm egg count, just to name a few. So just as a quick example, you can see there we've got YWT. So Y being the age stage refers to yearling, and then the next two letters WT refer to weight. And another example is PEMD, so post-weaning eye muscle depth. So P being the stage, that post-weaning age stage, and then EMD referring to eye muscle depth. So now we've got a little bit of a handle on what each of the different abbreviations stand for. I thought I'd discuss briefly on actually understanding what an ASBV means. So breeding values, or ASBVs, are based around an average of 0, and that was set back when we were first developing our analyses. So ASBVs will deviate either side of that 0 value. And it's important to remember that negative ASBVs, depending on the trait, are not always bad. So a good example of where you might prefer a negative breeding value is for this trait. So YFD, so yearling fiber diameter, you can actually see it's a negative value. And because we generally we want sheep that have finer wool, you actually want a breeding value that is more negative. So in this case, having a negative breeding value is more favorable. Other traits, obviously, if you're wanting more of that trait, so yearling clean fleece weight expressed as a percentage, we're wanting more fleece weight, so generally a positive breeding value is more favorable. So in this example, you can see that we have breeding values expressed here at the top, and then below that we have an accuracy. Now, an accuracy is just a reflection of the amount of information that is used in the analysis. So we saw before there's a whole range of different pieces of information that contribute to a breeding value, from genomics, pedigree, performance of half siblings, etc. So the accuracy is just a reflection of how much of the information is used. Now, a hot tip is if you're buying a team of rams, so you go to a sale each year and you might buy 4 or 5 rams, accuracies aren't generally something you would worry about too much because you're buying a team, and the average of that team, average breeding value of that team is the most important thing. And because you've bought more than one, you're not putting all your eggs in one basket. Generally, seed stock producers that might be using 1 ram in, say, an AI, artificial insemination program, are more focused on accuracy. And it's important though, despite ASBVs being based around 0, so the base of 0 was set quite a while ago, and obviously our sheep producers have made good genetic progress. We're producing very different sheep to what we were over 20, 30 years ago. So it's important that ASBVs are compared with the current average or percentile. So you can see here, this is a screenshot from the Sheep Genetics website where we've got the top 5, and top 10. So that's referring to the percentile which that trait now sits in. And I'll give an example of using a percentile band here. So this is the current Merino percentile band. And you can see that the average, despite the average being set at 0 all those years ago, has actually changed. So for clean fleece weight, the average is actually now 18.9%. Or the breeding value average is 18.9%, I should say. So using a quick example of using a percentile band, here I've got an animal and they might have a Y weight, so yearling weight of 9.4. So using the percentile band, I can go to the trait that I'm interested in, so yearling weight, And I can find that my animal has a breeding value of 9.4, and that currently sits in the top 15th percentile for that trait. Another example, yearling clean fleece weight. The animal that I'm looking at has a yearling clean fleece weight of 13. This actually sits towards the back end of the percentile band. So it's in the 75th percentile. So it's not as good for that trait relative to the other animals in the analysis. So now moving on, that we've got an understanding and of using breeding values in that sense, it's important to actually interpret what a breeding value means for your productivity on farm. So I thought I'd use a bit of a comparison here. I've got RAM A and RAM B, and we'll just look at the Y weight, so yearling weight ASBV for these two rams at the sale. So RAM A has an ASBV of 10.6 and RAM B has an ASBV of 4.2. So we can see here, that's their two breeding values, 10.6 for RAM A, 4.2 for RAM B. The difference between RAM A and RAM B is 6.4 kilos. So that's the difference between those two rams. Now, remembering that a ram only accounts for half the genetics of an animal. So he's only going to pass half of his genes on to his progeny because the other half are coming from the ewes that he's joined to. So the difference is 6.4 kilos, but because he's only passing on half, we divide that by 2. So the expected progeny difference between RAM A and RAM B is 3.1 kilos, meaning that RAM A will have progeny that on average are 3.1 kilos heavier at that yearling age stage than RAM B. So again, it's really important to understand that ASBVs express the genetic potential of that animal's offspring. And because they're only getting half of the genetic potential from that ram, the other half is coming from the ewes, that we divide that by 2. Another useful tool that we have to help with selection, because there are a lot of different ASBVs available for a lot of different traits, and we'll see that in later slides. But it's really important that you're not just selecting on one trait. Your breeding objective contains a lot of different traits, a lot of different goals or targets. So a selection index combines a lot of those ASBVs into a ranking of just one figure. So we're not don't have to look at all of them at once. We can use the selection index to rank animals. So the emphasis that is put on each trait in that index depends on the breeding objective or the goal behind that index. And we'll look at the different, a couple of different breeding objectives that sit behind some of our industry indexes. So that index gives you an overall merit or score to achieve a particular production goal that you're aiming for. So as an example, this is the range of indexes that we have available for producers that are looking to select merino rams. So we can use a bit of a flow chart of which of the following best describes your production system. So looking at the Central West environment where this webinar is targeted at, we're probably looking at a combination of some producers probably looking at this middle row or the end row here. So using the middle row, for example, where your income is a balance of wool and surplus merino sales, we would be looking at going this way versus maybe a New England focus where you might be looking at wool clip with a focus on superior wool quality. So if we flow down here, is reproduction or staple strength important in your flock? So I'm retaining ewes to keep in my flock. So yes, reproduction is important. And also with staple strength. So if I go a yes here, this is the most suitable index for me to be using based on the assumptions above. So the Merino Production Plus Index. If you were, if your income was a balance of wool and also meat production from terminal size, you'd be probably looking down the path of the DP or DP Plus Index here. So now that we know a little bit about indexes, how is it best to use an index when selecting rams for sale? So there's basically, it's a 3-step process. So the first thing to do is once we've selected that index, and in this example, we've selected that DP plus index, is to sort highest to lowest within that catalog on that index. because that's identifying animals that are going to be most profitable under that production system. But because an index is a combination of a range of different traits, it's still really important to look at the traits that are important to your business or breeding objective. And from that, we can create a bit of a shortlist. So using the example I've got here, where I've got RAM A, B, and C, and they've been sorted highest to lowest on this DP plus index. So RAM A has a DP plus index of 237, down to RAM C, which has a DP plus of 233. They're actually not that, that's not a huge range in index. They're not that different from each other, and they're all in the top 5%. But they actually got those high index values quite differently. So you can see here, for example, yielding clean fleece weight, RAM A is, he's still pretty good. He's in the top 20%, but he's certainly not as high as RAM B or C. And for this example, this trait, which is yielding worm egg count, where we're actually wanting less worms. So this is one of those traits where we want a more negative breeding value. You can see here that RAM C, despite having a similar index to RAM A, actually has a really quite a positive breeding value. So it would be undesirable in a production system where worms or worm burden is a real issue, say for example in the New England. So if you were purchasing rams to go into that environment and you saw an animal that had quite a positive worm egg count, you might remove him from your shortlist to look at before the sale. So once you've gone through, ranked on index, and made sure that the traits in that of that animal are still, are quite important to you, and they rank quite well for that trait, you can take that shortlist to the sale, and rather than looking through all 100 or 200 lots or 300, 400 lots at a sale, you can take that shortlist and just look at the animals that you've included on that list and do a visual appraisal of those animals to make sure that they're fit to take back to your farm and environment. Because whilst breeding values can tell you about the genetic merit of the animal, it's still important to make sure that that animal, its teeth, testicles, any other important visual factors that you'd like to take into consideration before you purchase that animal are considered. So finally, this section is about ASBVs to improve weaning outcomes. So we'll talk a little bit about setting a breeding objective, traits to target for improved weaning performance, and then accessing how to access these ASBVs coming into ram sale season. So coming back to a bit of a car analogy, I know I must love these because it's the second one for the presentation. But if I asked you the question, which car would you pick out of the ones on the screen? Some might say the Lambo, some might say the Ford, some might say the bus. But it really actually depends on what you're trying to do. If you're trying to move the rugby team out to Burke to play footy, you're probably not going to pick the two-seater Lamborghini. You're probably going to go with the bus. Likewise, if you wanted to go off-road or drive through one of the boggy council roads after a bit of rain, you're probably going to go with the Ford Ranger there. So it really depends on what you're trying to achieve. And sheep breeding is exactly the same. Everyone has a different breeding goal or objective. And it's really important that you define what it is that you're trying to achieve before you go and pick your index and look at the traits that are important to you. So one of the key steps is actually understanding what are the key profit traits on your farm. Is it body weight, fiber diameter, reproduction, parasite resistance, fly resistance? Are you spending a lot of money treating fly strike? Or are you looking at really targeting that lamb supply chain with lean meat yield and eating quality traits? So it's really important to identify which of those profit traits, and I'm sure there's others that I've left off there, but what are the profit traits on your farm? And then matching those traits up with useful ASBV selection traits. So we know that body weight matches pretty well with the weight traits that we have, but it's important to identify at what age stage is that body weight most relevant to you. Are you turning lambs off at 5 to 7 months of old? It's probably going to be the post-weaning age stage. If you're turning lambs off as suckers, maybe it's the weaning age stage. If you're keeping ewes and reproduction is important, so how many lambs you have born and weaned and marked every year. Is that an important profit driver trait? Because if it is, then number of lambs weaned is most likely the ASBV selection trait that's best suited to you. So it's really important to consider what your profit traits are and then match them up with the appropriate breeding values. And I cannot stress enough that it's important to have a written breeding objective. So most people go, oh yeah, I've got a breeding objective. I want to breed animals with more wool that grow faster, and I'm trying to stop mulesing. That's all very good. You've obviously identified what the key profit traits are, but really sitting down, writing out what they are, matching up with an ASBV trait, and then understanding where you want to buy rams and what ASBVs you should be targeting year on year, and refining that every year is really, really important step in the process. So what traits are available? I know we spoke about a few on the previous slide, but there's a whole range of and suite of traits depending on what you're wanting to target. And I've listed the majority of the major ones here, but there are other ones. So we've got growth traits, obviously live weight and early growth traits, but we also have adult weight. And that's becoming more important, particularly in some of the maternal analyses. We're actually trying to put a cap on adult weight. We don't want it getting any bigger. We're having difficulty getting shearers to shear larger maternal composite or first cross ewes. So breeders are actually using that trait in a different way. We're not wanting more. We're wanting to stop adult weight, but still have lambs that grow fast. There's also traits for carcass, so more meat, but also the quality of that meat. So looking at intramuscular fat, and some other predictors of eating quality. Lots of wool traits available, from your quantity traits, so wool weight, through to your quality traits, so diameter, strength. We've also got breeding values for CV, etc. Lots of reproduction traits. A number of lambs weaned is one of the main trait, but we've got some new breeding values for conception, litter size, and new rearing ability, which we can talk about more, and there's plenty of resources if you're interested to know about those. And then we've got traits that target health and well-being, so worm egg count and also breech wrinkle, which is becoming more important for those flocks that are looking towards a non-mule system. Now, getting to weaning, some of the key traits, and by no means is this an exclusive list, but these are probably some of the key traits to target if you're looking to improve the number and quantity of and quality of the lambs that you have at weaning time. So one of the key traits, it's in the name, is weaning weight, so why weight? And that basically means if you're selecting for animals with a higher breeding value for weaning weight, their progeny will be lambs that are heavier at the same age stages as animals with a lower or no breeding value in that case. Eye muscle and fat depth, that's by selecting on those traits, that's getting lambs on the ground that have improved carcass composition. So again, we can use these breeding values to select for more muscle and optimum fat cover. And that's probably important for those producers that are targeting the lamb market with their product. And then number of lambs weaned. So the number of lambs weaned breeding value, it's important to understand that refers to the breeding value of that ram's daughters. So number of lambs weaned isn't actually important if you're not keeping the daughter to you. It's not an important breeding value if you're not keeping the daughters of those of that ram. But if you're in a self-replacing merino operation, or you're producing first cross ewes where you've got a relationship with your first cross ewe buyer, number of lambs weaned is a really important trait. It's the rams that have a better number of lambs weaned will produce ewes that wean more lambs, and that's obviously targeting that weaning percentage. But it's really important, like these are just a few traits that that we should take into account for that weaning period, but we need to consider all these traits as part of your overall breeding objective, and linking that back to what the key profit drivers of your business are. Now that we're getting towards the back end of the presentation, and hopefully if you haven't already and you have an interest in looking at animals with breeding values or looking for animals in upcoming sales, I strongly recommend jumping on search.sheepgenetics.org.au. And this is the sheep genetics search site. So every animal that has publicly displayed ASBVs are available on this search site for any breed that you're interested in. There's also a sale catalogue section, so you can view upcoming sale catalogues for breeders that have uploaded animals. So if you're coming up to a sale and you want to check out the breeding values for that sale, or want to shop around across a few different sales, recommend jumping onto the search site, and you can customize and set up traits so that you're viewing the traits and indexes that are most relevant to you. You can also create a login. It's free, totally free. You can create a login and you can save any searches that you do on the website. So really recommend jumping on it and checking that one out. So just in summary of today's presentation, I think from the first section, we certainly saw that ASBVs are the best way of assessing an animal's genetic potential. And that's because we know that there's so many other factors, feed, birth type, age of the dam, that influence what an animal looks like. And ASBVs actually tell you about the genetic merit of an animal. And so the second key point there is that they inform you about how the progeny of that ram that you're purchasing will perform. So how many lambs their daughters will wean, or how heavy their progeny will be at the weaning age stage. And there's certainly, to target the weaning theme of the webinar series, there's certainly several key ASBVs out there that can be used to help improve those weaning outcomes. Now, if you'd like to contact me, my details are on the screen, but I strongly urge you, if you'd like to know more about breeding objectives, any of the ASBVs that we have available, to look at that bottom link, genetics.mla.com.au. There's a whole heap of short, sharp videos on how best to use these tools. So feel free to either contact me or strongly recommend you jump on and check that one out. Thanks, everyone, and look forward to hearing from you all and hopefully seeing you in person shortly.